I was 3 hours into my first night when I saw the thing that told me the place wasn't running right. The overhead lights were flat and white, and the air had that baked plastic heat mixed with the dry paint smell that always hangs over a floor like that. Line 4 hadn't even been brought up yet. I knew that for a fact, but there was already a full mannequin standing near the dark end of it, finished and upright like it had been set there waiting on us. Not a torso, not loose parts, a complete one. I just stood there staring at it because I knew how startup was supposed to look, and that wasn't it. That came later. At the start of the shift, none of it had happened yet. I got to Harrow Display Forms a little before 9 p.m., turned off the old service road, and followed the line of trailers backed up behind the loading docks until I found employee parking. The place sat out past the industrial strip outside High Point, North Carolina, the kind of area that looked dead in daylight and somehow worse under floodlights. Nothing around it but concrete, chain link, and low warehouse buildings with half the signs burned out. I killed the engine and stayed in the truck for a second with both hands on the wheel, just looking at the plant and trying not to think about the fact that I was back in a place like that at all. I'd spent too long telling myself I was done with factory work. When I was younger, that was the track I'd started on. Trade school, shop floors, production lines, forklift lanes, places where the light was always too white and every surface either rattled or hummed. After a few years, I got out and moved into jobs that sounded better when you said them out loud. Equipment sales for a while, a small warehouse supervisor job, then logistics. Nothing glamorous, but it felt like moving in the right direction. Cleaner shirts, less time on concrete, less feeling like the whole day was measured by whatever came off a line. Then the layoffs hit, and after that it all went bad faster than I expected. One short-term job turned into another. Bills stacked up, pride wore down. I picked up whatever I could just to keep things moving, and after a while that was all I was doing. Just buying another week every time I could. Harrow was one of the only places that called back fast. The posting had been short, almost weirdly short. Night shift, manufacturing experience preferred, decent hourly rate, shift differential, start immediately. That was about it. I called an old contact just to make sure it was real, and by the next afternoon, they had me filling out forms with Kelly Warren in a front office that smelled like copier toner and stale coffee. Drug screen, tax paperwork, safety sheet, badge photo. The whole thing moved so fast it didn't feel lucky. It felt like they needed bodies in steel-toe boots and didn't care much where those bodies had been a month earlier. Kelly slid my temporary badge across the desk and told me where night shift clocked in. She had that worn-out office voice people get in places that never really shut down. Professional, but already halfway into tomorrow. I clipped the badge to my shirt and headed down a narrow hall that opened into the back receiving area. Even before I hit the time clock, I could feel the building in the floor. Not loud exactly, more like a steady industrial vibration coming up through the concrete. That part didn't feel new. None of it did. I swiped in, waited for the machine to catch, and heard the little confirmation beep. A guy from night stood a few feet off with a clipboard under one arm. Broad shoulders, gray at the sides, face like he'd spent too many years under bad lighting. He looked at my badge, then at me. "You still know your way around a floor?" he asked. "Enough to get through a shift," I said. He gave one small nod like that was all he needed, and turned to lead me through receiving. We passed stacked pallets of boxed forms, bins of unfinished arms and legs, and a shrink-wrapped row of torso molds waiting to be moved. The air changed the deeper we went. Warmer, drier. I caught hot plastic first, then that powdery, paint-dry smell that always settles in your throat and stays there. Somewhere farther in, compressed air kicked and released with a hard little burst. I knew that sound. I knew the overhead light too, that flat white wash that makes everything look tired before the shift even starts. I wasn't relearning anything. That was the part I hated most. My body fell back into it too easily. The pace of walking the floor, the reflex of checking where pallet traffic crossed foot traffic, the habit of scanning for pinch points and dead corners and half-finished work somebody might leave in the way. It all came back fast, like I'd only been gone a week instead of years. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. There were little things I noticed before I ever stepped fully onto production. Nothing big enough to name yet, just enough to sit wrong. A pallet lane at the far end had fresh tape on the floor, like they'd changed a boundary recently. One of the men coming off break stopped at a closed gray door, looked at it for a second too long, then kept walking without touching the handle. A radio on a charging shelf crackled once with nothing on the other end, and nobody reacted. Not really. One guy glanced up, then back down, like he'd heard it before. That was the first hint the place had its own way of doing things, and not all of it was written on the safety posters. The man with the clipboard kept walking, and I followed him through the last set of double doors toward the floor. I could already hear the lines better now. Rollers, air, motors catching and settling into rhythm, regular sounds, familiar sounds, the kind that had paid my bills once before everything went sideways. I remember thinking, just get through the night. Don't make it personal. Don't start acting like you're too good to be here. Do the job, take the check, go home. Then I stepped onto the floor, and the whole place opened up under those white lights, and I had the first hard feeling that Harrow was going to ask for more than that. Bill took me down the main line first, not because that was where I'd be staying all night, but because everything on that floor fed off it one way or another. If you didn't understand where material was entering, where it was getting finished, and where the bad pieces were supposed to peel off, you were already behind. Nights weren't run for comfort. They were run to keep output moving, clear whatever had backed up on days, and make sure the morning crew didn't walk into a mess. He showed me where unfinished pieces came off staging, torsos in one area, arms and legs in another, heads farther down, packed in gray bins with dividers between them so the paint wouldn't pick up marks before they were ready. The line itself wasn't complicated once you knew the rhythm. Parts came in rough. They got cleaned up, checked, moved along, then passed off toward finishing and racked dry. Anything wrong got kicked off before pallet. At least that was how it was supposed to work. My job on nights was basically floor support with count responsibility at the back end. I wasn't running a machine. I wasn't doing maintenance either. I floated where they needed me, helped keep work from bottlenecking, checked finished counts against what the system thought should be there, and made sure rejects went where rejects were supposed to go. On paper, it wasn't hard. In real life, it meant you spent the whole night moving between other people's mistakes and trying not to let them turn into yours. That part felt familiar enough to make me tired before I'd done anything. The main line ran through the center of the floor, under the brightest lights. Off to one side were the drying racks, long metal frames where painted parts sat in rows with enough space between them to keep the finish from getting ruined. Beyond that was the reject and check area, which looked like every reject area I'd ever seen in my life. Bad lighting, clipboards, a steel table with one leg that didn't sit right, parts leaned up where they shouldn't have been, a trash barrel that always seemed too full no matter what shift it was. Farther down sat pallet staging and the lane they used to move finished forms toward the loading side. Past that was the end-of-line zone, darker than the rest, not because the lights were off, but because the light just seemed to die a little down there. That was the kind of detail I noticed, not because I was looking for ghosts, just because I'd worked enough places to know how a floor usually held itself together. Bill looked over the floor, not at me. "You've done nights before." "Long enough," I said. He kept his eyes on the line, then listened the first time. After that, he just kept walking, and I followed him. He didn't waste time telling me obvious things I already knew. He could tell pretty quick I wasn't green. I watched where the forklifts crossed. I looked at the floor markings before I stepped into any lane. I clocked which rollers had fresh grease on them and which ones were running a little dry by the sound. I checked where the unfinished pieces were stacking up and how long the handoff was taking between stations. That was all old reflex. I wasn't proud of it. It just came back. And because it came back, I could tell what felt normal. The normal stuff was easy. A bin too full because days had gotten lazy. A rack tagged wrong. A station lead trying to move a borderline piece through because nobody wanted to eat the scrap count. A pallet count getting sloppy near break because everybody's mind was already somewhere else. That stuff happened everywhere. What didn't feel normal was harder to pin down at first. One drying rack had more space around it than the others, like people had gotten in the habit of not crowding it. Nobody had marked off the floor. There was no sign. Still, the gap was there. Near reject, I saw one guy set down a bad arm mold and back off half a step before he turned away, like he'd caught himself standing closer than he wanted to. Small thing. Could have meant nothing. Then, over by pallet, Jeremy Voss checked the lane count, wrote something on his sheet, and looked back over his shoulder before he moved on. Not at a person, just at the lane itself, like he expected something to be different the second time he looked. I told myself that was just night shift behavior. Every place on nights develops its own habits. Some of them make sense if you stay long enough, some don't. People avoid a bad door, a dead radio spot, a station that jams more than it should. Nobody writes that stuff down. It just becomes part of the floor. Still, I noticed. That was the problem with going back to work like that after being away. I remembered too much. I remembered how quickly a place could tell on itself if you knew where to look. Not in some dramatic way. Just in little adjustments. The things workers stopped doing without talking about it. The places nobody leaned. The area everybody walked around, even though there was no reason to. I moved between the back half of the line and pallet staging for most of that first stretch. Finished pieces came through in batches, and I checked them against the work order as they built toward shipment count. If something looked off, it got peeled out and rerouted. If reject numbers looked too low for the amount of work coming through, that usually meant somebody upstream was letting bad pieces ride. If the count ran wrong, it was my problem before it became somebody else's. That was what made the job feel worse than I wanted to admit. I was back doing the exact kind of work I'd once promised myself I was done with, standing on concrete under white lights, checking numbers that mattered just enough to ruin your night if they were wrong. I needed the money, that was true. I also didn't have some better option waiting for me. That was true too. But the part I hated was how easy my hands remembered all of it. Where to set the scanner, how to hold the sheet flat against the clipboard so the paper didn't buckle in humid air. How to glance at a row of finished units and feel, before you counted, whether the number was going to come out right. That kind of work gets into you, even after you think you've left it. By the time first break got close, I knew enough about the floor to understand why Bill had said what he said, not the meaning of it yet, just the fact that he'd meant it. The younger guys weren't loud, the older ones weren't chatty. People did their jobs, but there was a layer under everything, some quiet agreement I hadn't been there long enough to know. Nobody said it out loud. I didn't ask either. I was too busy trying to figure out whether I was imagining it. Then I caught myself looking toward the far end of the floor again, toward the darker section past pallet staging, where the line ran out and the overhead light somehow felt thinner. Nothing was wrong yet. Not in a way I could prove. But I remember thinking that if something in a place like that was off, it wouldn't announce itself all at once. It would start small. One count, one station, one thing standing where it didn't belong. Bill didn't give me the rules all at once. If he had, I probably would have written half of them off as the usual night shift junk every place collects after enough years. Guys on overnights always build their own little religion around a floor. Don't use that side door after midnight. Don't trust the second scanner by receiving. Don't answer the radio if it crackles with no channel light. Most of it comes from boredom, habit, or one bad incident that gets stretched into something bigger every time it's retold. That wasn't how Bill handled it. He waited until break was over and the floor had settled back into rhythm. Rollers turning, air kicking on and off, the usual clatter of bins getting shifted from one station to the next. Then he jerked his head for me to follow him and walked me down the line again, slower this time, like he was showing me the place that sat underneath the one I'd already seen. We started near the darker half of the main line, where the finished forms came through before pallet staging. The lighting was still on, but it always felt dimmer down there, like the white overheads didn't carry as far as they were supposed to. There was a completed mannequin standing a little off from the rest of the work, close enough to the line to look like it belonged there, and just far enough off to bother me. Full body, finished surface, head on straight. It wasn't moving. It didn't have to. Bill nodded toward a finished form near the dark line. If one's already standing there before startup, don't count it. He said it the same way a man might say, don't put your hand under a jammed guard, or don't step inside a forklift lane without looking. No build-up, no ghost story voice, just a rule. I kept my eyes on the mannequin. The one I'd seen earlier was still sitting wrong in the back of my head, and hearing him say that out loud didn't help. It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like a correction for a mistake somebody had already made more than once. He kept walking before I could say anything. I followed him past a row of unfinished heads and neck molds, stacked in shallow trays. Most of them had the usual markings somewhere on them. Lot stamp, mold code, shift notation. Not pretty, but enough to track where a piece came from when something went bad. He stopped, picked up one neck mold just enough to turn it, then set it back without any extra motion. He tapped 2 fingers against the back of a neck mold. No lot stamp, don't touch the face. That one was specific enough to get my attention faster than the first. The first could have been written off as some inventory workaround. Weird, but still work-related. This one didn't have that cover. If a piece had no lot stamp, the problem should have been traceability, not whether somebody touched its face. I looked at the tray, then at him. Bill wasn't playing at anything. He had the same expression he'd had since the start of shift, flat, tired, like he was already spending energy on the fact that I might argue. We moved again. That was his way. Give it to me and keep going. Don't make room for a conversation unless it mattered. The shut end of the floor sat past the active line where the sound always changed. Even with machinery running in the building, you could hear when a section was live and when it was dead. Anybody who'd worked around production long enough knew that. Running equipment carried a pulse to it, a pattern, a mechanical breathing you stopped hearing only because you got used to it. Dead sections had their own feel too. They were still, or close enough. Bill looked toward the shut end of the floor. If a locked line still sounds live, don't go down there alone. That one landed harder, not because it sounded supernatural, because it sounded like something born from an actual hazard, a machine that wouldn't shut down clean, a belt carrying ghost air pressure, a relay sticking where it shouldn't. Plenty of bad things in a place like that started with somebody hearing something they thought they had time to check by themselves. I could almost excuse that rule into normalcy if I wanted to. Almost. We cut across toward the drying racks. The painted pieces sat there in rows under the same dead white lights. Each one turned out just enough to let the finish set clean. Faces blank, arms loose at their sides, some with heads on, some without. The racks were lined with the kind of order that should have felt cleaner than the rest of the floor. Instead, it just felt careful. Too careful, like the spacing mattered more than paint cure alone could explain. At the drying racks, he kept walking. If one of them turns toward the aisle, leave it that way. That was the first one that almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, just because it was exactly the kind of thing night crews say to each other when they've spent too many years under bad lights. A mannequin head turns a few degrees because someone bumped the rack or the wheel caught a crack in the floor, and by next month it's become one of those rules nobody remembers the origin of. But Bill didn't glance at me after he said it, didn't wait for me to smirk, didn't soften it with anything that would make it easier to dismiss. That was what kept bothering me. He wasn't trying to sell me on any of it. By the time we reached the pallet station, I was already doing what he wanted me to do without meaning to. I was matching each rule to a part of the floor and trying to imagine what would have happened to make a grown man say it like that. Not in theory, not as a story, as a correction. He stopped by the pallet station. If your count runs high by 1, don't do a second count. That one hit me in the part of my brain that still thought this whole thing had to come back to process. Count verification was part of my job. If the number ran wrong, you checked it again. That was the job. You checked the paperwork, checked the units, checked the lane, checked yourself, and then you fixed what needed fixing. That was how places like this held together in the first place. I looked at him. That's supposed to make sense. Bill took a second before answering. It doesn't have to. He looked past me toward the far end. It just has to keep you here till morning. After that, he headed back toward the line like the conversation was over. I stood there another second, looking at the pallet lane, then back toward the drying racks, then toward the darker end of the floor. I still didn't know what I believed. Half of it sounded like old night shift superstition dressed up in practical language. The other half sounded too narrow, too tested, to have come from nothing. Bill hadn't told me those rules like a man passing down stories. He'd told them like a man who was tired of watching people learn the same lesson the hard way. Later that night, a little after 1 a.m., I got sent over to reject and check because one of the daytime tags hadn't been cleared right and the back end was starting to stack up. Nothing dramatic about it. That kind of thing happened all the time. Somebody on days marked a piece for review, somebody else assumed the next guy would deal with it, and by nights it was sitting there in the way, turning one small delay into 3. The reject area looked worse the longer a shift went on. It always did. The light over that section had a duller cast to it, and the steel table there seemed to hold onto every scuff and scratch it had ever taken. There were 2 torsos laid out on foam blocks, one head set off by itself, and a finished form standing a few feet back near the far side of the table like it had been rolled there and forgotten. I started where I always would have started. Check the tag, match the piece, clear the hold if it was obvious, move on. The first torso was easy. Surface flaw near the left shoulder. Scrap. The head had a paint issue around one ear. That one probably could have gone either way depending on who was feeling generous. I bent over the paperwork, checked the handwritten note, then glanced toward the finished form standing by itself. That was the one that slowed me down. It wasn't that anything looked wrong from 10 feet back. It was a standard female display form, matte finish, neutral stance, arms at its sides. No wig, no clothing, no accessories. Just a full finished unit parked in reject when it should have either been tagged for rework or moved out. The thing that caught me first was how clean it looked compared to everything around it. Not newer exactly. Just untouched. Like it had missed the usual handling that leaves a smudge here or a mark there by the time something reaches that part of the floor. I walked over because that was the job. There were a few normal reasons it could have ended up there. Missing paperwork, misrouted final, undocumented sample, something old that had been dragged back out for comparison. Plants collect odd pieces over the years. They don't always leave a clean paper trail. I'd seen stranger stuff in warehouses and production rooms than one mannequin sitting where it shouldn't be. Still, I checked the usual places. The back of the neck first. That was where a lot of them got marked, depending on the mold and finish. My hand stopped short before I touched it, and I leaned in instead, catching the smell of cured paint and that warm plastic note that hangs around finished pieces. Nothing there. No lot stamp, no code, no faded partial marking. Just a smooth surface under the light. I crouched a little and checked the foot. Some plant stamped under the heel or along the base edge if the neck area got covered during finishing. Nothing there either. I shifted position and looked where I would have expected any backup trace mark to be if somebody had missed the primary stamp. Still nothing. No rubbed out number, no bad imprint, no smudged code that had gotten lost under paint. Nothing. And that was what felt wrong. A missed marking usually looks missed, a faint hit from a stamp, paint settled over half a number, a surface that shows somebody meant to mark it and didn't finish. This didn't look missed. It looked absent, clean absent, like the piece had never been part of the system in the first place. Bill's voice came back to me right then. No lot stamp, don't touch the face. That was the first time one of his rules stopped sounding like old shift nonsense and started sounding like a thing a man says because he has seen what happens if you ignore it. I was close enough to the form that touching the face would have been the easiest thing in the world. People do it without thinking. You steady the head, turn it toward the light, check the finish around the nose or cheekbone. That's normal handling. I didn't do it. I told myself that didn't mean anything. Maybe I was just letting Bill's weird little floor sermon get into my head. Maybe I was more tired than I wanted to admit. I'd been back in a plant for less than one shift. My feet already hurt. My collar had that sticky, damp feel where sweat dried and came back again. And I was standing in the reject area at 1 a.m, staring at a mannequin like it owed me an explanation. I straightened up and looked around for whoever had last worked that section. That was when I saw Leon Draper farther down, near the end of the steel table, sorting through a stack of reject tags with the slow, careful way older floor guys move when they've spent years making sure nothing jerks wrong in their back. He wasn't a big man, but there was something heavy about him anyway, not physically, more like the shift had settled into him over time. He worked without wasting motion, didn't hurry, didn't look curious, didn't look surprised to see me standing there either. I pointed at the form. This one doesn't have a stamp. Leon Draper didn't come closer. Then leave it where it is. He said it from where he stood, like distance mattered. I kept my eyes on the mannequin. Up close, it still looked ordinary. That was part of it. Nothing dramatic. No cracked finish. No weird posture. No damage I could use to file it under some normal category and move on. That happen a lot? I asked. Leon kept his eyes off the face. Enough. That was all he gave me. He didn't come over to inspect it. Didn't argue. Didn't explain where it came from or who should have logged it or why a finished unit with no trace mark was standing in reject like that to begin with. He just kept sorting tags, slow and even, like the answer should have been enough for any man with sense. I wish I could say I took that as a clear warning right then. I didn't. Not fully. I was still trying to keep one foot on the side of the world that made sense. I told myself, maybe Leon was one of those guys who'd been on nights too long and turned ordinary process failures into rules because it was easier than fixing paperwork. Every plant has somebody like that. A man who stops asking why and starts building habits around the mess instead. But I noticed something anyway. Leon never once looked straight at the mannequin's face, not while he answered me, not while I stood there, not even by accident. His eyes went to the table, the tags, the floor, the side of the form, then back to his hands. Everywhere except the face. That was what finally got under my skin. Not because it proved anything. It didn't. A missing lot stamp was still something I could have explained away if I worked at it hard enough. Old unit, bad tracking, sample that never got entered right. All of that was still possible. But the way Leon handled it didn't feel like a man dealing with a paperwork problem. It felt like a man staying inside a boundary he'd learned not to cross. I left the form where it was and went back to clearing the rest of the reject pile, but the whole time I could feel that one sitting behind me in the room, not moving, not doing anything. Just standing there in a place meant for bad pieces, with no stamp on the neck, no stamp on the foot, and no sign it had ever belonged to the line at all. I came back the next night because I needed the money. There wasn't any cleaner answer than that. I didn't sleep much after the first shift. I kept waking up with that reject area form in my head, the smooth back of the neck under the light, the foot with nothing stamped under it, Leon answering me without ever looking at the face. By morning, I'd already started doing what people always do when they want to stay on the right side of reality. I told myself it had probably been an undocumented sample. Old stock. A piece that got finished for display and drifted back into the wrong area. Plants lose track of things. Warehouses do it too. Stuff gets moved, relabeled, forgotten, found again. I didn't really believe that by the end of the day, but I said it to myself anyway. Then rent hit my account, my card payment posted, and by the time I was pulling my boots on again, a little before 8:30 p.m., I was back to the same basic math I'd been doing for months, one shift at a time, one check at a time. Don't get proud, don't get stupid. If a place is weird, keep your head down and get through it. The floor looked almost better on the second night, which somehow made it worse. Everything was up and moving when I came in. More noise, more forklift traffic, more bins staged where they belonged. Enough ordinary work in motion to make the whole place feel like maybe I'd let one strange hour get too deep into my head. That happens sometimes on nights. Your body gets tired in the wrong way, and the building starts pressing on you. Every shadow seems a little too still. Every sound seems like it means more than it does. I wanted that to be all it was. They had me moving between the back half of finishing and pallet staging again. Same basic role as the night before. Keep product from stacking up, help clear handoff jams, check finish counts against the work order, and make sure what was headed toward shipping matched what the system thought should be there. The practical stuff still felt familiar. Clipboard in one hand, scanner in the other, paper curling a little at the corners from the warm air. My shirt already sticking between my shoulder blades not long into the shift. All of that was normal. I let myself settle into it. I think that was the trap. Not because the place was trying to fool me, just because routine is how you talk yourself into staying. Paul Minton showed up about an hour in when a pallet count on the back lane started lagging behind what the tablet said we should have had ready. He was exactly the kind of floor supervisor every plant ends up with eventually. Mid-40s maybe. Pressed work shirt, belt radio. A face that always looked like he was already irritated at the next problem, not the current one. He didn't waste words, and he didn't like surprises unless they made numbers come out better than expected. He walked up beside me while I was checking the sheet against the lane and held the tablet out just enough for me to see the line item totals. Paul looked at the tablet. System says you're light. I checked the pallet lane again. No, it's high by 1. That got his attention in a way being light hadn't. Light made sense. Missed scan. Piece stuck upstream. Somebody moved something before it got entered. High by 1 was messier. High by 1 meant there was an extra finished unit in a lane where finished counts were supposed to close clean. Paul frowned at the screen. Then counted again. He said it without looking up from the tablet, like it was obvious, and under any normal circumstance it would have been. That was the job. If the count came up wrong, you checked it again before you dragged anybody else into it. I already had the first count in my head. I could have done the second one right then. Start from the left pallet edge, work in by row, verify tags, compare against the shipping breakdown. Easy, fast. Except Bill's voice was sitting in the back of my mind like it had been there all day. If your count runs high by 1, don't do a second count. Jeremy Voss was at the next lane over, breaking down wrap from an earlier pallet and pretending not to pay attention. He was younger than me by a few years, maybe late 20s, the kind of guy who still had enough energy to move fast without it looking painful. He also had that same half-guarded way of carrying himself I'd started noticing in people on that floor. Like he was always keeping a little space between himself and whatever might go wrong. Jeremy Voss was already looking somewhere else. I wouldn't. I looked at him. Wouldn't what? Jeremy rubbed at the back of his neck. Do a second count on nights. He kept his voice low, low enough that Paul either didn't hear him or decided not to bother with it. Paul was already turning back to the screen, stabbing at it with one finger, probably trying to see whether some earlier scan had duplicated or a work order had updated wrong. He wanted a clean number. That was the whole world to a man in his position. Clean number, right pallet count, truck leaves on time, nobody higher up asks what happened in the night. I stood there looking at the lane. It was a simple setup. 3 finished units wrapped on one pallet, 3 on the next, and a partial on the back edge where the row should have been short according to the system. Except it wasn't short. That was the problem. There was one more finished form standing in that lane than the work order should have allowed, and not by accident either. It wasn't tipped off to the side or left in a bad spot by a forklift. It was in line, clean, positioned like it belonged to the batch. That was what got under me. Same thing as the first night, not the extra itself, the way it fit. If something had gone wrong with handling, there should have been signs of handling. A rushed move, a bad tag, a unit parked out of place waiting for somebody to claim it. But this one was sitting there inside the logic of the lane, like it had arrived with the rest and nobody had seen a problem until the number came due. Paul finally looked up from the tablet. He wasn't interested in Jeremy. He was interested in me doing the thing he'd just told me to do. I didn't move. That was enough to make him annoyed, not angry. Just annoyed in that management way that says they're recalculating whether you're going to become more trouble than you're worth. He stepped closer to the lane and looked over the wrapped units, then back at the screen, then at me again. I could almost see him trying to fit my hesitation into some normal category. New hire confusion, slow counting, maybe nerves about being back on a floor after time away. Any of that would have made more sense than what was actually going through my head. It wasn't that I believed in anything. Not yet. It was that I now had 2 things that didn't belong there. A finished form with no lot stamp. A lane count high by exactly 1. Neither proved anything on its own, but they rhymed, and I couldn't stop feeling that. I crouched beside the back pallet and checked the tags again instead of recounting the forms themselves. Lot sequence matched on the wrapped units. Shift notation matched. Final destination code was right. Nothing obvious. No paperwork error jumping up to save me. I stood again and took one slow look down the line of finished forms. One of them was facing a few degrees off from the others. Not much, barely anything. Enough that I might not have noticed if Bill hadn't walked me past the drying racks the night before and told me what he told me. This one wasn't on a rack, and it wasn't turned toward the aisle, not fully. Still, its head sat just slightly different from the rest of the row. I stared at it long enough to make myself angry. That kind of thing happens all the time, I told myself. Somebody bumped it when they wrapped. Somebody nudged it shifting the pallet jack. Plastic forms aren't sacred objects. They get moved by tired people with bad footing and half their attention on the clock. The problem was, that explanation should have calmed me down. It didn't. Paul was still waiting. I told him I wanted to check whether one of the units had been carried forward from a previous batch before we touched the count. That at least sounded like work, sounded like I was being careful instead of difficult. He gave me a look that said I had about 1 minute left before he stopped being patient and started being supervisory in a way nobody enjoys. So I checked the nearby paperwork. Not the count itself. I stayed just on the safe side of what Bill had warned me about and hated myself a little for even thinking that way. In any other plant, I would have rolled my eyes at it, but I still kept avoiding the second count. Jeremy had gone quiet again, but I could feel him there a lane over, not watching me too directly. That bothered me too. If he'd laughed, I might have felt better. If he'd told me I was being an idiot, I might have snapped out of it. Instead, he just kept doing what he was doing and staying out of it like a man who had already made peace with the fact that some things on that floor were better left alone. I found nothing in the paperwork to rescue the number. No duplicate scan. No hold release that would have pushed a piece forward. No cross-batch transfer. On paper, the system was wrong. Or the lane was. It had to be one of those. There wasn't supposed to be a third option. And that was when I understood the real change from the night before. The missing stamp in reject had still felt local. Contained. One strange unit in one ugly corner of the floor. This didn't feel local. This was in the count. In the flow. In the part of the shift that decided what was real enough to leave the building. Paul eventually pulled another lead over to verify the lane count instead of waiting on me to do it again myself. I didn't argue. I didn't volunteer either. I just stepped back and watched while he turned the problem into somebody else's task. It was a relief for about 10 seconds. Then, the second lead counted the lane once, frowned, and said he needed to pull a tag check before signing off on anything. He didn't do a second full count either. That was the moment the floor got smaller around me. Not because I had proof, I still didn't, but because now it wasn't just Bill with his rules, and Leon with his careful distance, and Jeremy with his half-mumbled warning. Now I had a growing sense that people on nights had built little workarounds into the shift to keep from touching the same wrong thing too directly. No meetings, no memos, no official language for it. Just people changing how they moved around certain problems and hoping morning never had to hear about any of it. The lane got cleared by paperwork instead of recount. Paul hated it, but he let it go because the numbers could still be pushed through clean enough to keep the schedule moving. That was all he wanted. He moved on to the next issue before the unease could become a discussion. I stayed at the back half of the floor for the rest of that stretch, doing my job, scanning, checking, moving things where they belonged. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, something had. The place wasn't just producing odd moments anymore. It was starting to repeat itself. Same shape, same pressure point, same feeling that there was one extra thing inside the system that the system itself did not know how to name. And worse than that, I was starting to understand why a man like Bill didn't explain the rules. Because once the pattern starts, explanation doesn't help much. You either feel it or you don't. I came in the next night already tired, not just from work. Tired in that mean way where your head never really shuts off, even when your body does. I'd spent half the day replaying the count from the night before and telling myself I was making too much out of it. Then I put my boots on anyway and went in. The work helped at first. A station at finishing was lagging. One of the pallet lanes had to be cleared because days had left it stacked badly. There was a handoff problem between cleanup and final inspection that kept slowing the back half of the line. Normal problems, useful problems, the kind that make a place feel ordinary because they're so aggravating and familiar. I leaned into that as hard as I could. Scan, check, move, verify. Keep your hands busy and your mind stays out of trouble. It worked for a while. Sometime after midnight, the floor started thinning out the way it always does on overnights. Not empty exactly, just stretched. One forklift farther away than you want it. One radio reply taking too long. One whole corner of the building feeling like it belongs to somebody else's shift now. The active line was still running, but the back end had eased enough that you could hear the dead sections better. Or at least you were supposed to hear them as dead. I was carrying a clipboard back from pallet staging when I caught it for the first time. A low roller sound. Not loud. More like a short drag and settle, like something turning where it shouldn't have had power. I stopped walking and listened. The live part of the floor was still doing what live floors do. Compressed air kicked somewhere behind me. A bin got set down too hard across the aisle. Somebody laughed once and it bounced off the overheads, but under that, farther down, there it was again. A faint mechanical turn from the wrong end of the building. My first thought wasn't supernatural. It was hazard. That's how a place like that trains you. If a line is locked out and you hear movement past shutdown, you think stuck relay, leftover pressure, something carrying motion when it shouldn't. That's enough to hurt somebody, enough to drag a hand, catch a sleeve, throw a piece into the wrong lane. Real damage, real paperwork, real blood if a man gets too casual around it. I knew all that before I ever knew anything else about the place. So I set the clipboard down on the edge of a pallet and listened harder. Nothing. I picked it back up, took maybe 6 steps toward the dark end of the floor, and heard it again. A short run over rollers, then a little hiss, like line air taking one dry breath and stopping. I heard the rollers before I saw the panel lights. Line 4 sat down past the active work, mostly dark except for the spill of overhead light that never quite reached where it should. It had been shut earlier. I knew that. I'd seen the lock panel myself when I came through the back half of the floor. Now, one of the indicator lights was on, not bright, just a dull little square of color where there shouldn't have been one. I didn't go straight down there. I want that clear. I was already thinking about Bill's rule before I got halfway closer. If a locked line still sounds live, don't go down there alone. I remembered it because it had made the most practical sense when he said it. Practical was what I wanted. I wanted all of it to come back to something practical. Still, I edged closer than I should have, not all the way, just enough to see whether the panel was really lit or if I was catching some reflection from the active line behind me. The air changed as I moved toward that end. Cooler in the draft near the bay wall. Less noise from the crew, more space between sounds. The rollers didn't kick again, but that almost made it worse. Now I had the feeling of having heard something without enough proof to justify how hard my heart had started beating. About 20 feet short of the line, I stopped. There was a form standing near the far side of the lane. At first I thought it was just one of the finished units waiting to be staged. Then I realized it was too far down, too close to the shut section, and too isolated from everything else around it. One mannequin, upright, not tipped or parked or half hidden with other product, just standing there where no one should have left it. The line beside it was supposed to be locked. The active work was all behind me. There was no reason for anything finished to be sitting in that dead space by itself. I told myself maybe a forklift had set it there earlier. Maybe someone on days had staged it wrong and nobody had cleared it. That explanation lasted about 2 seconds, right up until I noticed the head. It wasn't facing the line. It wasn't turned all the way toward me either, which somehow would have felt easier to understand. It was just off. Angled a few degrees toward the aisle, toward open floor, the way something looks when it has already started paying attention before you admit it has. I backed up, not dramatically, not sprinting, just one step, then another, keeping my eyes on it because I suddenly didn't trust myself not to lose where it was if I looked away. That was new. That was one more support gone right there. Up to that point, even when I'd been unsettled, I still trusted the building itself. Trusted that what belonged to the shift and what didn't were at least separate categories. This felt different. This felt like something from the wrong side of the rules had stepped into the same physical space as the rest of the work and was holding there just fine. I turned and went looking for Bill. I found him near the racks. Line 4 is still breathing. Bill didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on me first, then looked past me toward the back end of the floor without moving his feet. That pause did more to tighten my chest than if he'd jumped straight to talking. A man pauses like that when he's sorting whether the next answer matters or not. Then he said, "You went down there alone?" "Not all the way," I said. He looked toward the dark end of the floor. "Keep it that way." That was it. No panic, no cursing, no hurry. He started walking past me toward the back half, And I followed because at that point, following him felt better than standing there with my own thoughts. He didn't speed up, didn't grab a radio, didn't call for maintenance, just headed that way with the same hard, even pace he used for everything else. That should have made me feel foolish. If it was a real machine hazard, he should have moved faster. If it wasn't, then I should have felt stupid for dragging him out there over a bad light and a shape in the wrong place. Instead, I felt worse. Because Bill moved like a man who had done this before. We stopped well short of the shut line, farther back than I had gone on my own. He looked at the panel, then along the lane, then toward the spot where I'd seen the form. It was still there. Same position, same slight turn of the head. I wanted him to say it was just staged wrong. I wanted him to tell me which crew had left it, which forklift operator had screwed up, which work order had bled into the wrong section. Anything with a name on it, anything I could put in the same category as every other plant mistake I'd ever dealt with. He said nothing. The panel light went dark. Neither of us moved. A few seconds later, I heard the rollers again. Soft, brief. From somewhere deeper than the panel this time, like motion carrying through the section after the power had already gone. Not enough to prove anything if you hadn't already been listening for it. Enough to make my skin tighten across the back of my neck. Bill still didn't step in. That mattered. More than the sound. More than the light. More than the mannequin standing where it shouldn't have been. Bill had spent too many years on that floor for me to believe he was careless. If he wasn't willing to walk into that space alone, then I was done telling myself I was being dramatic. He finally shifted his weight and glanced toward the nearest radio charging shelf, but he didn't call anybody. Nights only made things official when they had no choice left. A radio would have turned it into an event, made somebody write it down, dragged other people into a thing the shift had clearly spent years keeping unofficial. The form at the end of the lane looked different when I stared too long, not moving. I don't mean that, just harder to read. 1 second it seemed closer to straight, the next it looked more angled than before, and I couldn't tell whether that was the light, the distance, or my own eyes starting to fail me in exactly the wrong way. That was another thing the place took from me that night. Trust in what I had actually seen. Bill eventually told me to go back to the active line and stay where the floor was live and crowded. He didn't say it like a comfort. He said it like instruction. I did what he said. I spent the next hour moving through regular work with half my mind still stuck down at line 4. Every time the active rollers paused, I found myself listening for the dead ones. Every time I looked toward the darker end, I had to fight the urge to count silhouettes, units on pallets, figures by racks, bodies in motion, make sure nothing had added itself where it didn't belong. By the end of that night, the cost was already there. The problem wasn't only in reject anymore. It wasn't only in the count either. It had moved into motion, into sound, into the dead machinery itself. The floor no longer felt like a place where strange things happened once in a while. It felt like a place that could answer back if you stood too close and waited long enough. And after that, I stopped telling myself the rules were just there to calm jumpy people down. They were there because something on that shift did not care whether a section was locked, logged, or supposed to be empty. I wish I could say I broke that rule by accident. I didn't. It happened on the 4th night, not long before 2 a.m., with the back end running thin again and too much of the floor feeling stretched out in all the wrong places. By then I'd heard a locked line breathe after shutdown. I'd seen a finished form sitting where no finished form should have been. I'd watched grown men on nights work around certain problems without ever saying what the problem was. And I was getting sick of it, not scared. Sick of it. There's a difference. Fear makes you back off. What I was feeling by then was meaner than that. I'd come back to work like this because it was the one thing I still knew how to do without pretending. I knew how lines moved. I knew how counts drifted when somebody got lazy. I knew how paperwork lied, and how pallets got stacked wrong, and how one bad handoff upstream could make 3 people argue at the back end an hour later. That was supposed to be the solid part, the one piece of me that still worked. And that place had started pushing on exactly that. We had another lane count issue near shipping, same shape as before, same bad little catch in the middle of an otherwise normal stretch of work. The numbers on the run sheet were supposed to land clean after the last finished batch came through. Instead, the lane looked high again, not wildly off, just enough to stick in the teeth, exactly 1 unit too many if my first pass was right. I stood there with the clipboard in one hand and the scanner in the other, staring at the row until the forms stopped looking like product and started looking like a test. Jeremy was a few feet off, stripping broken wrap from an earlier pallet and trying too hard not to look over. I looked at the lane again. I'm counting it 1 more time. Jeremy shook his head. Chris, don't. It's a number, not a ghost, I said. Jeremy didn't look at me when he answered. That's what I thought too. That was what bothered me. Not just the words, the way he said them. Flat, tired. Like he wasn't trying to stop me anymore, just marking the point where I'd made my own decision. I set the scanner down and started again from the left edge of the lane. I counted the first pallet slow, then the second, then the partial at the back where the lane should have come up short if the paperwork was right. I checked tags as I went because I wanted this to stay inside process, stay inside work, shift code, lot marks, destination, sequence. My mouth was dry by the time I finished, and I could feel my pulse in the side of my neck in a way that made me mad at myself. The second count came out clean, perfectly clean. No extra unit, no overflow, no high by 1. The number matched the paperwork so neatly it should have calmed me down right there. It should have felt like relief, like maybe I was tired, maybe I'd rushed the first pass. Maybe the whole thing was finally dropping back into the world where mistakes had ordinary causes. Instead, I just stood there staring at the lane because one of the forms had moved, not across the floor, not dramatically. It was still inside the same pallet group, still upright, still part of the row. But the unit I could have sworn had been on the back end of the partial was now turned inward a few degrees, tucked visually into the count in a way it hadn't been before. And one that had been squared with the row was now sitting where my eye had placed the other one. That sounds small. I know it does. If I heard somebody else say it, I'd probably think the same thing. Long shift, bad light. He mixed up 2 identical forms and let his nerves do the rest. That was what I told myself for the first few seconds. Then I looked down at my own sheet. I'd marked the first count too fast and too hard, enough that the pen had pressed through to the next page. I could still see where I'd paused at the back edge of the lane. I knew exactly where my eye had caught the extra. I knew exactly which position had felt wrong. I wasn't remembering vaguely. I was remembering with the kind of certainty you build only after years of checking rows, stacks, counts, and sequence until your brain starts seeing mistakes before your hand confirms them. That was the part that dropped out under me. Not the lane, not the mannequin, me. I had come back there because I thought, if nothing else, I could still do this. Maybe my life had gone sideways. Maybe better jobs had dried up. Maybe I was back under white lights on a concrete floor because things had gone worse than I wanted to admit. But I could still trust what I was good at. I could still trust the simple, ugly skills that keep a place like that from slipping apart. Count it, check it, know what's there. That was supposed to be mine. And now I was standing in front of a pallet lane with a clean second count and no confidence at all in what I had seen 30 seconds earlier. I looked over at Jeremy, and he looked away so fast it was almost rude. Not because he didn't want to help, because he already knew the shape of what I was trying to do and wanted no part of the second it landed. I checked the tags again. Same sequence, same routing, same everything. I forced myself to look at the forms one by one without recounting them a third time. I wasn't ready to admit Bill's rule had gotten into me that deeply, but I couldn't make myself do it, not after the second count came out perfect, not after the lane had somehow started looking more correct the longer I stared at it. That was the part that got me. If the number had stayed wrong, I could have fought it. Bad scan, bad paperwork, bad handoff, something I could chase. But a clean number leaves you nowhere to go when your own eyes are the thing that broke. A forklift rolled past at the far end of the aisle, and I flinched hard enough to feel stupid. I picked up the scanner, then put it back down because my hand was slick. The floor around me was still doing what floors do. Radios, boots, rap crackling, airlines kicking. Somebody on the active side laughed once at something I couldn't hear. Ordinary noise. Ordinary work. That almost made it worse. The place didn't need to stop being a factory to get inside my head. It could stay completely functional and still ruin the one thing I had trusted about myself. I cleared the lane on paperwork and tag sequence without logging any count issue. I hated that. Hated how much it felt like giving in. Hated even more that it was the only thing I could do without forcing myself into a third pass I no longer believed would tell me the truth. When I moved away from the pallet lane, I caught myself counting other things without meaning to. 3 racks, 2 jacks, 4 men at the station by cleanup. Then I'd look again and have to stop myself before I checked whether the number still held. That was new. That had never happened to me before that place. It wasn't just that the floor was getting strange. It was that the floor had started using my own habits against me. I didn't go looking for Leon right away. For a while after that second count, I just kept moving because I didn't know what else to do. I finished what was in front of me, signed off on what could be signed off on, kept my hands busy in that dead automatic way your body falls into when your head has started slipping behind it. Every normal task felt thinner than it had an hour earlier. Not fake, just thinner. Like the floor had peeled back one layer and now I could feel something under the ordinary movement of the shift that hadn't been there for me before. Or maybe it had been there the whole time and I'd finally run out of ways to excuse it. That was probably closer. I kept seeing the same pieces line up whether I wanted them to or not. The finished form standing there before startup on my first night, like the line had produced something before the line was even awake. The one in reject with no lot stamp anywhere on it, not because somebody missed it, but because it looked like it had never belonged to the system in the first place. The lock section of line 4 breathing after shutdown. The heads on the racks turned just enough toward the aisle to make a man notice and then hate himself for noticing. The count running high by 1, then coming out perfectly clean when I forced it through a second pass. And under all of that, the rule Bill had given me that still hadn't happened in front of me yet. If one of them is wearing anything that didn't come from the plant, don't go near it. That one had stayed with me more than I wanted to admit. Not because it was the strangest, because it implied the problem didn't stop at the line or reject or count verification. It implied something could cross farther into the world of the shift than it should, far enough to pick up what didn't belong to production, far enough that somebody had to make a rule about it. I tried to stay on the active side of the floor after that, tried to keep other people in sight, tried not to let my eyes drift toward the darker end unless I had a reason. It didn't help much. Once your own confidence in what you've seen starts cracking, the whole place changes around it. Every finished unit in a lane starts looking slightly different from the one beside it. Every mannequin on a rack feels like it has just enough shape to it to hold your eye half a second too long. You don't even need anything new to happen. The old things keep working on you just fine. At some point I realized I was listening for the deadline again. Not because I heard it this time, because I was waiting for it. That was when I knew I needed somebody to stop treating me like a man who could figure it out on his own. Bill had given me rules. Jeremy had given me warnings in pieces. Paul only cared what the numbers looked like when they left his screen. Leon was the only one who had looked like this was not a surprise to him and not a topic he was interested in dressing up. I found him at the end of the floor, near the same ugly steel table by Reject, where I'd seen that unstamped form on my first night. He was alone, checking a stack of tags under the dull light, slow as ever, like the hour didn't matter and the building couldn't hurry him if it wanted to. I stopped a few feet off from him and looked down the darker lane beyond the table before I said anything. Nothing stood there. Nothing moved. The fact that I checked first made me angrier than I expected. I found Leon Draper at the end of the floor. "Tell me what keeps showing up down here." Leon took his time answering. He finished the tag in his hand first, set it down, looked at the table, then past me. Not at my face, not at the darker lane. Just past me, the way a man looks when he already knows he's about to say more than he wants to. Then he said, "Not everything on this floor comes off a line." I stared at him. "Then why keep it here?" He looked toward the pallet lane. "We don't keep it." He let that sit there. Then he said, "We just don't log it." That should have sounded stupid, or vague, or like an old man on nights trying to turn bad process into folklore because the real explanation got lost a long time ago. If he'd said it on my first night, that probably is how I would have heard it. But by then I had too many pieces in my hands already, and what he said did something worse than answer them. It made them fit, not neatly. Worse than neatly. It made the rules make sense. Not everything on the floor came off a line. That explained the part that had kept scraping at me since the first shift. The finished form before startup. The missing lot stamp. The counts that drifted high by one in a way that didn't behave like a paperwork error. The reason nobody seemed interested in fixing the problem the normal way. There was nothing to fix if the extra unit had never entered through the same path as the rest. No upstream mistake, no duplicate scan, no missed tag, no bad handoff from one station to another. The thing itself wasn't passing through production. It was inserting itself into production after the fact, and Night Shift had built a whole private way of surviving around that without ever forcing the day side to name it. I looked back toward the lane and felt something in me go flat. That was what the rules were for. Not to solve anything. Not to understand it either, just to keep the shift from getting too close. If one was already standing there before startup, you didn't count it. If it had no lot stamp, you didn't touch the face. If the count ran high by one, you didn't do it twice. The rest of the rules all pointed the same way. Don't follow it farther than you have to. Don't correct it. Don't step toward it alone. And if it ever showed up carrying something from outside the plant, stay away from it. I wanted to ask Leon how long it had been happening. I wanted to ask whether anybody on days knew, whether management knew, whether a place like this had always had one wrong unit moving through it, or whether it started at some point and everybody just failed to stop it. I wanted to ask him what happened if somebody did count it all the way through. If somebody touched the face, if somebody walked down to a live locked line alone and kept going. But the truth was, I already understood why nobody had answered those questions for me before. Because the rules were cleaner than the answers. If somebody sat me down and told me a full story, I would have argued with it, picked at it, tried to make it sound stupid, tried to turn it back into a machine problem or a floor rumor or one of those ugly little industrial legends people build when too many men spend too many nights in the same bad light. But the rules didn't need me to believe. They only needed me to stop doing certain things. That was why Bill talked the way he did. Why Jeremy never finished a thought if he could avoid it. Why Leon never looked at the face. This place didn't make the wrong thing. It just kept having to work around it. And suddenly, Paul made sense too. Maybe not all of him, but enough. A man like Paul didn't want a mystery. He wanted a clean outbound number and no disruption. He didn't need to understand what Knights had built around the problem. He only needed the problem kept small enough that it never reached his level in words anybody had to write down. That might have been the ugliest part of it. The whole shift had figured out how to move around it without ever saying what it was. Not fix it, not stop it, just keep it from getting big enough that anybody had to explain it. Leon still hadn't looked at me directly. He was back on the tags like the conversation had already ended. I stood there a little longer anyway, staring past the reject table toward the deeper dark where the dead section started. For a second, I thought I saw fabric near one of the forms farther back, not plant wrap, not tag ribbon, something softer than that. I didn't stay there long enough to make sure. I didn't need any more explanation by then. More explanation would only have made it cheaper. The truth was already bad enough in the shape it had. Night shift's job wasn't to understand what kept showing up. It was to keep it out of the official count long enough for morning to arrive. I didn't finish that shift, not all at once, not in some dramatic way where everything stopped and everybody finally had to admit what had been sitting on nights all along. The floor kept moving. The active line kept feeding work through. Radios still cracked. Forklifts still crossed the marked lanes. Somebody on cleanup was still arguing about a bad handoff on the far side like the world hadn't tilted under my feet in the last 20 minutes. That was part of what made the choice feel so final. The place didn't need me to believe in it. It didn't need me to understand it. It could keep running either way. After I talked to Leon, I went back toward the pallet lanes and stood there for a second with my hands empty, looking at rows of finished forms that all seemed just normal enough to make me hate them. I knew what the job was now, not the one on paper, the real one. Keep the count moving. Keep the wrong thing out of the official number. Don't force the floor to answer more directly than it already had. And I knew I couldn't do that. Not anymore. I couldn't keep pretending a clean number meant I was safe. I couldn't keep doing second-hand work for something nobody was willing to name. Most of all, I couldn't keep standing in a place that had started using the one skill I came back with against me. That was the choice. Not courage, not panic. Just a point where something in me finally gave up on making the place make sense. I finished what was in my hands because that was muscle memory by then. Cleared one tag, moved one tote, signed off on a handoff that somebody else should have done 10 minutes earlier. Then I took my clipboard back to the station, set it down, and unclipped my badge. For a second, I just stood there holding it. That stupid little piece of plastic felt heavier than it should have, not because I cared about the job. Because I did care, more than I wanted to admit, about what it meant that I couldn't do it. I'd walked back into that building because I thought this kind of work was still mine. Ugly work, tiring work, work that leaves your clothes smelling like heat and dust and paint by the time you get home. But mine. Something I still knew how to do when the cleaner version of my life had already fallen apart. Turns out knowing the job didn't help much once I stopped trusting what the job was showing me. I left the badge in my locker with the door hanging half open. Didn't even bother snapping it shut. I texted the number Kelly Warren had used to send my schedule and wrote that I was done, effective immediately. No details, no excuse, just done. I stared at the message for a second before I sent it, like maybe I owed somebody a cleaner explanation. Then I thought about the pallet lane, the second count, the way a perfect number had wrecked me worse than a bad one ever could, and I hit send. I walked out before the shift ended. Nobody stopped me. I'm not sure anybody saw. Maybe Jeremy did. Maybe Bill did, and let me go because there was nothing left to say. I never found out. I cut across the back hall, hit the time clock area, pushed through the door into the night air, and kept going until I was at my truck with my hand shaking harder than I wanted to see. I sat there for a long minute with the engine off. I thought I'd feel relief first. I didn't. What I felt was stripped out, like the place had taken something small but central and left the rest of me to figure out how to stand without it. The next morning they called once, then once more around noon. I didn't answer. After that it stopped. I never went back. For a while I told myself that was all it was. Another job gone bad. Another place I couldn't stay. That was easy enough to say out loud. The harder part came later, when I started trying to look for work again and realized what Harrow had actually left me with. I couldn't do inventory anymore. I couldn't do warehouse work. Couldn't do line support. Couldn't stand in front of pallet rows or stock shelves or shipping lanes and trust what my own head was doing. Every time I looked at grouped objects, my brain started counting before I asked it to. Cases of drinks in a grocery back room, folding chairs stacked against a wall, storage bins in a hardware aisle. It all happened fast and mean, like a reflex I'd picked up somewhere poisonous. And if the count felt wrong by even one, I'd lock up. That's the part nobody sees after a place like that. They think getting out means you're done with it. It doesn't. Sometimes it just means the damage doesn't show right away. I picked up odd jobs after that, delivery runs, short-term labor, cash work when I could get it. Nothing stable, but at least most of it let me avoid the kind of work that asks you to trust numbers and layout and your own eyes all at once. Then, a few weeks later, I was walking downtown just after sunrise, cutting across a block before a day job I'd taken unloading supply crates for a renovation crew. Most of the storefronts were still dark, metal grates up, lights off. Just that early morning city quiet where everything feels half-built for the day. I was passing a clothing store when something in the display window caught my eye. Not movement. Just that little internal snag you get when something in a row isn't sitting right. I stopped before I meant to. There were 3 mannequins in the front display. 2 farther back, 1 closer to the glass. The one nearest the front was dressed in a pale sweater and dark pants, posed the way they always are, shoulders square to the street, body angled just enough to make the clothes sit better under the lights. It should have been facing straight out toward the sidewalk. Its head was turned at me. Not all the way. Not wildly. Just enough. Enough that I knew it hadn't been posed for the street anymore. Enough that if I took 2 more steps closer, I'd start trying to measure the angle and talk myself into some reason for it. Reflection in the glass, bad memory. Store staff dressing the window in a hurry. Any excuse I could drag in to keep the world nailed down where I wanted it. A man opening the shop glanced at me. "You okay?" I kept walking. "Yeah," I said. I didn't look back. That was the one that stayed with me after all of it. Not the first one, not the one about the face, not even the one about the line still breathing after shutdown. The one that stayed was simpler than that. If the count feels high by 1, don't check twice.